Hello and welcome to Why We Lead, educating today's warfighters to be modern and effective military leaders. Hey everybody, my name is Chris Little. I'm here with Josh Powers today, the field grade leader. I've known him for a couple years now. It's actually kind of the reason why I got into kind of article writing. He just posted something. He was like, "Hey, anybody want to write an article?" I was like, "Well, I've always kind of wanted to write, sure, why not?" And it kind of started from there. And then I started Why We Lead, a little bit more Air Force focused from Army focused, just to get a different perspective. And the video thing kind of just worked out. And I was like, "Hey, Josh, you want to do a video?" He's like, "Sure." But it's worked out really well so far. So, Josh, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of how you got to where you are today?
Yeah, absolutely, Chris. Thanks for having me on today. So I came out of doing what we call key and developmental jobs, or KD jobs. So I was the operations officer for a brigade combat team. That's about 3,500 soldiers, in a pretty large organization. So I came out of that job, and I'd learned a ton in that position. It was super hard, very very challenging position, and I learned a bunch of stuff kind of through brute strength and ignorance. But one of the things that I really enjoyed most about being in that position was I had numerous young lieutenants and captains
Mhm.
that I worked with, and it was great to have those guys and gals come to me for leadership and for mentorship. And I remember just on numerous occasions, every other week, every week or so, we would kind of sit down at the end of the week, no one else left in the headquarters. We'd have a beer and we just kind of talk about the army and the military and leadership, and what they had coming up and that kind of stuff. And I loved that aspect of leadership as an operations officer. So fast forward just a couple of weeks later, and I was missing that after I came out of the job,
Mhm.
and I wanted to be able to combine that experience, kind of coaching these young leaders and working with them, but also sharing some of the lessons that I learned through failure and through just not knowing. And that's kind of the way everybody stumbles into these hard jobs. So I wrote a couple of articles that gave my experience, and gave some feedback. And whatever, nothing's going to come of this.
Yeah.
I put them out into the world. This was back in 2016. Just kind of shot them out to the world, and I started to get some feedback from folks that it was kind of interesting.
Mhm.
So I kept posting articles, and lo and behold, the kingmaker, if you will, of the military blog world, the Doctrine Man,
Yep.
reposted one of my articles after I put up a small blog that I had running, and sure enough, it started to catch. So from there, I just kind of stumbled into the field grade leader, to do exactly the things that I had missed. Just an opportunity for people to talk and to interact on social media, for people to engage with other like-minded professionals. And then as it evolved, it turned into a place where people could write, and kind of turned into a community blog where people just like you, Chris, could jump in and could give feedback and interact with each other and share their ideas. And it's such a neat thing because it's not about me. I'm just here enabling it. What I think is so important to our community and the way that we're doing leadership now is your perspective is important, right? Like there is no one else in the world that has the same perspective that you do. They're not in the same position. They don't have the same experiences. They don't view things the same way. So literally anyone that is watching this, you have something to share. Just write it down, put your ideas together, get it out there, get it to anybody that'll publish. Chris will publish it, I'll publish it, anybody will publish it. And you will be amazed at the feedback that you get, and how powerful what you're learning is. And all of that, it gives back to our community, and it also makes you better as a leader. So that's how I got into the field grade leader and kind of where I'm operating now.
Yeah, that's awesome. I know it's hard for a lot of people to get outside their comfort zone, and I would argue doing things like this is well outside of my comfort zone. But I think it's hard to grow as a leader if you're not continually trying to get yourself outside of comfort zone. And you mentioned earlier about you were a major, with 3,500 people that you're working with. Like, I feel like at least in the Army, y'all get bred a lot earlier to lead a lot more people at a younger age, I think, compared to the Air Force. One of our first opportunities is as a flight commander, kind of like later captain kind of time frame. And even then, it's only like 30, 35 people. So I feel like there's a big difference kind of, at least from the Air Force perspective, on leadership. And that's with the rated career field, like flying and things like that. Um, Perhaps because they just want us focusing on flying for so long and then lead people later. I'm not quite sure the exact reasoning behind it, but I think it's fantastic that you just got thrown into this huge job with 3,500 people. Like, that's just incredible and kind of blows my mind, really. Um,
Yeah.
and
Hmm.
that they invested you with so many people. Um, and I think the blog world, especially with leadership, is kind of growing. You started it, what, 5 years ago, you said? And
Yeah, just about.
I've loved it just to kind of see it grow continually. And the Doctor Man, like, he's obviously has a huge following. So that's been a fantastic kind of outlet to help get things going, especially for people like us, just like, yeah, we got some good ideas, but how do you get the word out there kind of thing? So I think that's pretty fantastic. Speaking of blogging and everything, and I know we talk about books a lot and everything, but what are you currently reading?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I am so this year I made I'm not a New Year's resolution because I don't do those. I did a goal, and my goal was to read some of the best books. I said 10, and I'm working my way towards 10 of the best fictions ever written. So I crowdsourced it. I put it out
Uh-huh.
onto social media to ask folks kind of what they thought, and there were a lot of things that people gave feedback on, that I've worked my way through some Hemingway already, and so I slugged through a couple of those really quickly, and now starting probably in February, I went into Atlas Shrugged,
Mhm.
which is really good, and it is amazing, and all the things that go with it. But man, it is the most dense book I think I have ever read, alongside doctrine and some military
Auschwitz.
theorists. It's probably amongst the most dense. So, but I'm slogging. I'm continuing to work my way through it and continuing to grind. I switched over to Audible recently so I could go a little
Nice.
bit faster because I found myself asleep every time I tried to read it in person. And I think I have like, I don't know, like 65 hours of listening left to go. I'm not sure, but I'm
Wow.
going to keep on grinding on it. And I think the important thing about reading is like rounding out your experience level. If you've read Mattis's most recent book, he talks about reading and how it gave him experiences to fall back on when he got into a new or an uncertain um, environment or whatever. And I think that's the important thing, is that it gives you, and I'll use a weightlifting term because I like to exercise. It gives
Mhm.
you reps and sets and things that you don't normally do. So when you get into a new environment, you have a different lens to view a problem set, and that can be through military theory, that could be through Clausewitz, as you described, that could be through Boyd or any of other theorists, but it could also be life experiences of biographies, etc. You could look to leadership lessons from Ulysses S. Grant, Sherman, or other military leaders. You could look at Colin Powell. You could look at Mattis. You could understand the things that they've experienced in their lives, and it makes you look at situations differently. And I'd give you like one of the principles that I believe in leadership that is unchanging in principle, is that leadership is not static, right? Like you can't ever get to a point in your leadership where you're like, that's it, I'm done. This is exactly how it will be forever. You
Mhm.
have to continue to ingest new ideas, to understand the environment, to understand the world, and kind of put all of those things together. So reading constantly reading gives you the opportunity to adapt your leadership principles, to learn something new, and to continue to be relevant in your approach.
Yeah, and all those people you mentioned, including yourself and a lot of people I talk to, everybody just reads a lot. And for me, Audible works pretty well because I have a 40-minute drive to work every day, and that's kind of how I kind of chug through books like you were talking about, and it's worked out really, really well. I like that you said that you're kind of reading fiction now as opposed to strictly nonfiction. I relate a little bit more to nonfiction, as I'm sure you probably do too, but I can't remember where it was. It was either somebody you interviewed or somebody said that they kind of intersperse fiction and nonfiction to kind of like round out, and fiction more for using your imagination in certain ways and kind of getting outside of the box of thinking. So I find that kind of fascinating that you're slugging through fictions right now. Um, I typically stay in nonfiction. I just actually got through with the Centurions. I kind of had to chug through that one. I think General McChrystal or something was talking about that in one of his books. I was like, I'll give that a try. And that was kind of a marathon one too. It was really good, but it was definitely making me kind of think a little bit more. So you kind of mentioned it earlier, what leadership is to you. Obviously, it's not static. How have you you said you were with 3,500 people, and obviously you had a track record before that, but how have you helped develop leaders in the past, particularly, I guess, from the Army side, both officer and enlisted? Because from my understanding, the Army is a little bit more enlisted heavy as opposed to the Air Force. So I was curious on your take on that.
Yeah, so I think it's important to highlight when we talk leadership. So the
Mhm.
Army does, like you said, does a good job of getting you to lead people, but there's a transition point that is interesting that we kind of go between. So tactical level leadership is leadership of anywhere from 34 35 people, which you do as a lieutenant when you're a platoon leader, and it kind of goes up anywhere. As a company commander in Afghanistan, I had about 135 people. And then if you are a battalion commander, you have anywhere up to 700 or so people, and that's tactical level leadership. But there's a transition point somewhere between a company and a battalion where you are more of an organizational leader than you are a tactical leader, in my opinion. Right? You're still
Mhm.
doing tactical stuff, but as a company commander in Afghanistan, I knew the names of every soldier in my company. They knew me by the sound of my voice at night. I knew them by the sound of their voice at night. I walked on missions with them. We had a bond that is one-on-one with I would say every soldier in my company, and that is kind of a direct leadership approach that is important, and there are key principles that are involved there. Now, transition, like we talked about, as an operations officer for a brigade combat team, I did not know 3,500 people,
Yeah.
3,400 people inside of the brigade, right? I knew a very small number, probably in the ballpark of, let's say, 60 or so people that I worked very closely with that were inside of the operation shop, and some of the other leaders that were dispersed amongst the brigade combat team. So in that regard, I was an organizational leader where my leadership was still applied. I influenced the organization, but not in a direct manner like I did as a company commander. So I coach a lot of folks about that transition between direct and organizational leadership. And it is important to note that there are some principles that still apply in regards to character, competencies, humility, etc. But there are some direct leadership approaches that do not work, right? And so I always use the analogy. It's one of the images that I've shared since I've kind of been on this kick about organizational leadership.
Uh-huh.
Is a plate spinner. Back in the circus, you look at a picture from the early circus days, and there's a guy, and he's spinning a plate. He's got these sticks set up, and there
Mhm.
are plates on top of it. He's got one going, he does another, and he does another. And so you'll see these pictures, and the guy's got 20 plates going. As a tactical leader, as a lieutenant, as a captain, like, you're spinning one plate and
Mhm.
you can spin that plate and you can focus on it and you can apply your leadership directly to that plate or to that problem set or to that mission or, whatever it is you've been charged to do. And you can do it directly.
Mhm.
As an organizational leader, you can't do that. You got 10 plates going. If you spend all your time focus on one plate and spinning one plate, all of the others will fall down. So understanding that you have to be able to influence other subordinates to accomplish missions rather than do them directly is kind of a key transitional point for folks as organizational leaders. It's not just about one task or one thing, it's about multiples. And the other aspect that is very hard to understand and is very hard to put into play is a systems approach to organizational leadership. So I've given this one as another kind of a way of knowing if you have a problem with a system, is understanding the difference between a system problem and a symptom, right? So a lot of what we do in the Army as organizational leaders is about reporting on your organization, understanding, the readiness level of your soldiers, or understanding the readiness level of your equipment, the training readiness, etc. So if you are looking at if you're looking at something like that, and you continue to not get a good answer back out of the process, you get it once, like, okay, maybe that thing is a problem. I don't have enough soldiers trained. I don't have the right equipment, whatever it is. If it spits back out of the machine again the second time, like, that's interesting. If you get it a third time, it's probably a system. It's probably a system problem that you need to fix. So it's not the number of soldiers trained, or it's not the equipment or whatever. It's something in a system approach that you need to unravel and solve. What is the process for getting those soldiers trained? How often are you running a range to accomplish that mission set? How are you enabling subordinate units to get the assets that they need to do it? So it's looking deeper at understanding that system approach, rather than, why isn't everyone trained? Go get Anderson from 3rd Squad and get him out there. It's broader than that. And it's really hard for folks to kind of understand that, because you don't see the immediate response like you would in the direct leadership approach. You can't get Anderson out to the range, get him trained, now your numbers are good. It's a long-term approach that takes a little bit more time to watch those systems.
Yeah, that's interesting, because currently, obviously, I'm at the tactical level. So, I think reading right now, kind of going back a little bit, did that help you prepare at all for that? Or it's just kind of like you get in it, experience it, and you kind of learn from there?
Yeah, there's a ton of great reading that you can do that can get you into that framework. The tactical stuff, there's a million different things on that regard. But as you transition to this organizational or systems approach, it's going to sound nerdy, but you can get into a lot of reading on organizational theory. The business books are very, very good here. And then anything on systems theory, complexity theory, like, those are the type of things where you really begin to understand how systems function. So the business stuff is really actually key as you transition here. And I can't think any titles off the top of my head right now, but I'll shoot you a couple you can drop into the comments, or I'll drop them into the comments, that are good kind of starter books from an organizational perspective on how to make systems like that work.
Okay. Yeah. Have you seen people like kind of stall out at that level at all? Like, they were awesome tactical leaders, and then they mentally just couldn't kind of make the switch as a leader?
Yeah, you see it all the time. I see it all the time. You see folks that can't make the transition. They are successful at the direct leadership approach, and then transitioning to a systems-oriented organizational approach, like, they can't make the leap. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. Like, the world needs great tactical leaders. They need hands-on leaders that can accomplish those things as well. And then also, you see folks that are not necessarily great tactical leaders that are super awesome from an organizational perspective as well. You don't have to be good at both, I don't think. And it's okay to be good at one or good at another. I think another thing that's key for any leader is understanding and realizing your personal shortfalls, and then offsetting that shortfall. So you see leaders who are particularly gifted in this regard. And I could name, I'm not going to, but I could name a million that understand their shortcomings or their shortfalls as leaders. And then they build teams that are better at that thing than they are. Then they trust and empower their subordinates to excel at it. And I've watched 4-star generals that are quite successful at doing that, and they're amazing, and everything that they do is amazing because they have a great team that they trust and empower. Does that make sense?
Oh, it sure does. I was actually just talking about that the other day with, my analogy was, hey, I'm really good at report writing. There's other things like decorations and like training reports that I'm not particularly the expert at. And I had to kind of trust my team as the lead of that team. Like, I know that y'all are going to get that done and everything. And it really worked out. Obviously, that's kind of at the tactical level thing, but yeah,
But that
trusting your team,
translates,
I
right?
think,
So
is super
yeah,
important. And,
so
and we,
that's a huge translation point. And it goes back to humility,
Mhm.
because an alpha leader who is good tactically and can do all the tactical things to make them happen often struggles where they get to a place that is unusual or uncomfortable to them. They have trouble admitting that they are not the best at all of the facets, writing awards or whatever it is. Where
Mhm.
a humble leader, and using a humble leadership approach, can say, hey, I'm not good at this. Like,
Yeah.
hello, this is me. My name is Josh Powers, and I am not good at doing this thing. But Chris Little is. Like, would you please be the person who does this? I am empowering you to make this happen. And that's where magic happens.
I would wholeheartedly agree with that. And I think that kind of is what sets ignorant kind of leaders that are unsuccessful, who want to be successful, and who never have made that transition to trust. And I was listening to Colin Powell the other day on one of his speeches, and somebody asked him, like, hey, in your 40 years of public service, like, what was a huge thing that helped you lead? And he, immediately, without even blinking, he was like, trust. And I think it'd be hard to get there, particularly probably at a 4-star level, without trust, because I know even at a captain level, it's the same thing. So to kind
Yeah.
of wrap things up here, looking back at your younger career, we all fail or make mistakes at some point. What advice would you give, or it doesn't even have to be to a captain, it could be even to a lieutenant or a young NCO or anything. What would you have done, particularly as Josh Powers, maybe a little bit differently as a younger LT or a captain?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the first and most important aspect is what you described there in the lead in, right? Everyone fails. And I think that as a tactical leader, coming out of tactical experience in Iraq, and in Afghanistan, I was not a humble leader. And so I had a number of successes back to back to back to back to back, in combat, through some really challenging times in combat. And I kind of forgot that I could fail, and I kind of lost humility as a young leader.
Mhm.
And it took a major failure for me to kind of wake up and understand that. So realizing that everyone is mortal and everyone makes mistakes enables you to learn. And the faster you realize that as a young person, I'm sure you remember that from being a lieutenant. You're like, I can't. You go from being a second lieutenant where you mess everything up to a first lieutenant where you can't mess anything up, and you're
Yeah.
like, I can't fail. But the sooner you realize that you can learn and you can adapt, the better you'll be. And then transitioning that, my failure, I wrote an article about it. I won't rehash the whole thing,
Mhm.
but it was a huge upset in my career. It was the first major failure that I ever had as a kind of a more senior captain, and I felt like quitting. I felt let down in myself. I was embarrassed. I was humiliated in this failure,
Mhm.
for not being selected to serve in an exceptionally selective unit. But then on the flip side, over the next year of not being selected and going forward in my career, I learned more than I ever learned anywhere else because I was open to that feedback. So the key piece of advice that I'd give you is that failure is not a dead end unless you let it be a dead end. Failure is not the end of the road. It is opportunity after opportunity after opportunity. You just have to look at it the right way. You have to learn from your mistakes, and then you have to continue to adapt and move forward as a leader. And if you can think that way, then you'll never stop learning. You'll never stop growing as a leader.
That is awesome. I couldn't have summed that up better myself. Well, Josh, I sure appreciate your time today. I know you got some family stuff to do, I'm sure, but I hope you have a wonderful day.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it. Have a good day.